don't want to open it. Yeah. That's good.
Well, I thought it would be interesting because it had like a lot of cool pictures and like it was made by a teenager of like the 1920s, so I was like, oh, that'd be cool to see what it was like back then.
So for my research, I first watched the movie Seventh Heaven, and I just kind of did a background research on like what the movie was about and who the actors were. None of them were from Charlottesville, but then I looked at the theaters that played Seventh Heaven and other movies in the scrapbook, and one of them in particular was the Jefferson Theater, and I just kind of found out about how like deep in history that one is with, you know, it going through and originally becoming as a bank and then evolving into this big theater that everyone like wanted to go to and experience.
Well, I looked into a couple of the actors, like Gary Cooper and Nancy Carroll, and they were some of the biggest actors of their time, so like that was really interesting to look into and see like what kinds of things were influencing kids in the area. I also looked into the Lafayette Theater, and it was it was really popular and apparently really beautiful and really extravagant. Like the South said it was one of the most beautiful theaters for the South, so I thought that was interesting. But sadly it was destroyed in the 60s, so sadly we can't see it anymore, but still pretty cool to see.
My favorite part was probably like the first bit of like finding out what object we wanted to pick, just because there was a wide range of decisions we could have made, and it was very like loose, and we could just like, you know, pick what we wanted, and it could be really centered towards our interests.
Okay, so if I'm being honest, I chose this quilt with like a false preconceived sort of notion because I thought it was possibly made or paying dues to enslave people. But once I researched who Carrie Brindley actually was, I was almost like repulsed by the sort of person she was and sort of confused why people would even want to make this quilt for her as like a present because she was a teacher.
So I was doing a research paper on different types of historical figures in Virginia who, like how they correlate to education. And I wanted to do some research on like basically what children were learning about in schools at that time pertaining to history.
I guess it would say that it was just a picture of just Vinegar Hill residents just going about their daily life and like reading about how people described Vinegar Hill. It was quite, well, mainly white people, and how they described Vinegar Hill was quite different from the own story that I had in my head when I saw the photo first.
Yeah, so while I was doing research on this item, I found out it was written by a very conservative woman who had written lots of books about the history of Virginia. And I really wanted to look into that book and see just exactly like what she was depicting in this book that many children would later on like learn about, and that would eventually like shape their views of many like racial problems and stuff like that. So I found that there were definitely a lot of problems in that book. She portrayed the South as a very like beautiful, grand place. So yeah.
I was surprised that many of the articles that I read, they were like, oh, she's a historical activist, and they were like glorifying her and heroifying her, even though if you look at what ideas she actually supported, she was not a great person. And I was most surprised that everyone was really happy because she started a tradition that students would go to the Lee and Jackson statues and leave flowers. They were like, oh, she's such an amazing principal because she's paying honor to them.
I was looking in the beginning of the book, and she was talking about like John Smith's encounters with the Monacans when he first arrived here, and I think there were like 10 pages where she just like kept using the word savages over and over, just describing how basically terrible they were. So that was definitely shocking to read about that.
Those who are, it fits because the Vinegar Hill residents were disproportionately affected because of their race. And I think that it just fits with Charlottesville, because when I think of Charlottesville, I think of just racism, and it's hard, like, it's, as someone who's from Charlottesville, it's like very sad for me to say that, but it's very true. And I think that Charlottesville has a history, and the Charlottesville Albemarle area has a history of affecting those who are disproportionately, who are put into these categories based off of their race, and that it is just Charlottesville in the Albemarle area, and
That this stuff was like very common all throughout schools. Like, it's not only this book that was, you know, teaching these kids so many different ways to think about, you know, African Americans and Native Americans very badly. There are many other books like this. This is just one of them.
I was just interested to see what high schoolers were doing in 1944. Yeah, so the Jefferson School was started in 1926, I think, under the Freedmen's Bureau, after the Civil War, to educate Black children in Charlottesville. And I just sort of found out like what they were educating people on, like the age range of high schoolers, and stuff like that.
The fact that there were students that were trying to enroll in an all-white school, I thought that was pretty cool, because it's also pretty dangerous because something could have happened to them, but I think they succeeded at the end.
Well, it plays a pretty significant role as the only high school. It was named Charlottesville High School until like the early 1970s, when the Charlottesville High School got built on Melbourne Road, which is now where it's used, well, where the building is, where the high school is. So it played a pretty significant part. A lot of people went there. If like people have lived here for, like went to the school in the 60s, 70s, they went there. And it was also a big part of like desegregating Virginia. Like Charlottesville was one of the cities that held out pretty long, and the fact that people were brave enough to go in there and do that is amazing.
Well, there's this guy named Eugene Williams who went to the Jefferson School, and he actually became the chair of the NAACP in 1954, I think, and he was like really influential when it came to integrating schools in Charlottesville, and I'd like never heard his name, which was surprising to me.
I thought it was interesting. Here at Renaissance we have our own handbook, and it's unique. And I was intrigued to see what the handbook would be like for Lane, especially in that time period.
I was kind of interested in how dominoes had evolved over time and how similar they look to the way they look now. Also, I just like the game of dominoes, so that kind of drew me to it as well.
I chose a chess set that is supposedly made from bullets gathered at after the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse.
My item was the All About Town, a Charlottesville board game.
Well, there wasn't much history on my item specifically, but in the box that they were kept in, there was a note saying part of the toys owned by a little girl who played with them after the war between the states, which was interesting. I think probably some child had them maybe when they immigrated here. And then I did some research and I compared some photos, and looks like they might be from around 19th century or so.
So the board game connects to Albemarle history because it shows what the map was like in 1980, and also what people, just a board game that people would play at the time, and it's not seen very much anymore. But yeah.
Well, going to the Historical Society and organizing the parts of a museum and such, I am interested in history, very much interested in history, and so this is going into a historical society and doing stuff with them, which I enjoyed very much.
Well, this specific uniform was used in the Dogwood Festival Grand Parade. So the festival is it's an important part of this community.
The marching band helmet was from Lane High School, and it was used by the marching band, who usually supported the football games they had, because their school was very well known for their football team, and they had around like a 53 game win streak.
Well, my grandmother, when I was younger, she made a lot of like dresses for me by hand. So I don't know, like seeing the uniform kind of reminded me of those. My mom did baton twirling when she was in high school, but like I didn't realize like how popular it would have been at the time. I don't know, so I didn't really think about how many people she must have been baton twirling with. Like, it was kind of, I always thought of it as like I knew she was on a team, but I kind of always thought of it as just her. But now I'm learning, like, you know, now I'm learning about it, and I'm realizing how many people she must have known who did that with her. And that's really cool.
But I was a little surprised by how widely sold this specific edition of the book was, because it was sold in many of the major cities across the country and is actually still available to be bought on some websites.
I chose Higher Lessons in English by Alonzo Reed and Bernard Kellogg. The book actually basically created modern English sentence diagramming.
But there's actually a lot of really interesting stuff in the history of math education. Like it didn't actually become a large standard in schools until around the 1950s with the beginning of the space race. And it actually was not taught at all from the early to the mid 1700s because it was pushed out by some religious groups who thought it was quote unquote not useful skill.
Well, I study Latin myself. I'm very interested in ancient languages. And I also really wanted to find out how education differed back then to how it does now. And so I chose that one to kind of study the differences in the exercises that the book chose and how they went about teaching Latin.
I definitely enjoyed going to the museum and seeing all the different choices people had made, and just seeing all the history that was kept there and learning little bits of everything that they had, little bits of what's there at the museum. It was quite interesting to look at.
I also found out regarding gender that the authors, as far as this subject in particular, were not in, I don't think they were in support of women learning this matter, because when they referenced students in the introduction, they were very clear to use the term boys, men, and he, him. So I have a feeling that they were not very much in favor of women learning Latin and the logistics of it.
It shows sort of that schools in Charlottesville were either a little bit ahead of the time or up with the times. Like, we were not entirely backwater, especially like in terms of mathematics. Because, yeah, it was around that time that algebra started being integrated into like high school and middle school curriculum.
I got to handle a 100-year-old book. I did not think I could do that.
I loved actually going to the Historical Society and just looking at all of the artifacts and just like kind of holding them and like feeling them. It was just it was a really cool sensory experience because you know the backstory of them. These are like objects from the history of Albemarle County, and like you're kind of just holding, and it's a pretty cool feeling when you're just holding them, and it's like, wow, this is like from 1890, from 1920 Albemarle. And so yeah, just looking through all the artifacts and kind of just feeling them out, I guess. That was probably my favorite part.
I want people to remember and to take away that there are so many different narratives that you can discover, and that it's important not to assume what media or articles or even people tell you about someone or something or an event. It's important to delve deep and to understand all of the viewpoints that come into that.
My favorite part was just learning more about Charlottesville, and because I was born in Charlottesville and I've stayed in Charlottesville my whole life, and I think that even like going, like even through like my education, I haven't learned much about like the actual history of Charlottesville, and I think that this project definitely did that, and I learned a lot, whether it was good or whether it was bad.
Learning more about Charlottesville history, even though a lot of it did suck, there were some good people in there that did some cool things, so that was what it got, yeah.
Just researching about like the historical context of where we live, I feel like is very interesting. Getting to know more about the things we have here or the things we used to have here, and we can go back in history to track like where these objects are from.
Well, just how this ordinary thing that we don't think about much, it just had a really interesting history, and the stuff that we don't think about much could have a really interesting story behind it.
It's not really touched on a lot, Charlottesville history. We all know a lot about, in school you're taught like, the basic history of like United States, and you don't really focus on your hometown as much, and it's really interesting, especially this like time frame that the handbook was written in. It's very tumultuous. However, like Lane also played a very big part in Charlottesville history, and the fact that I didn't even know that was it is probably like, pay more attention when you're walking around, because there's a lot of like little plaques everywhere, and if you ever go to Bodo's, you're probably gonna pass it, and it's pretty big, and yeah, it's pretty cool.